What is up, everybody? This is Voth, and in this video we're going to be discussing the overall flavor and playstyle of the Dwarves. Now, if you've read any of J.R.R. Tolkien's books or seen any of the corresponding movies, then you pretty much know the Dwarves. This is apparent in their elaborate architecture, their propensity for growing long beards and the way in which they adorn them, and of course, their seething and fervent hatred that they have for the orcs. Now, I think it should be said that since J.R.R. Tolkien is to this day an incredibly influential and popular English writer, and Games Workshop is an English company, for them not to lovingly recreate the mythos, in my opinion, would just be bollocks. Now let's talk about their roster. It's going to be about as deep and varied as they are tall, mostly made up of dwarves and the machines that they build, dog not included. Now that doesn't mean that they won't be fun to play, because their quirkiness and extreme eccentricity will no doubt make them very entertaining, especially in the voice acting department. Now it is time to talk infantry. And as you may assume, dwarf infantry is very slow, but what they lack in speed, they make up for in armor. In fact, at their core, their infantry only really come in two types, heavy and very heavy. And they also have a faction-wide trait that in the tabletop, any dwarf with a shield can enter shield wall, so it's safe to assume that their line infantry is going to have this ability. And dwarves are not without their shock infantry. This unit of hammerers can pulverize a unit on the charge in a very literal sense of the word. This unit of slayers will likely function like berserkers, and they're probably the only unit that you will find on the dwarven roster that is not completely covered in armor. Now let's talk about their skirmishing. And I use the term skirmish lightly because this unit of thunderers goes into battle with heavy armor and potentially a shield, so this makes them closer to line infantry with guns than it does to classic skirmishing units. Now this unit of quarrelers also fits into that unique category because they wear heavy armor, have the potential of carrying a shield, and bring a crossbow to combat. Now if the last two units bent the rules that defined skirmishing, this unit almost breaks those rules entirely. They are called iron drakes. They wear heavy armor, they carry what looks like a personal-sized cannon to battle, and they hit like dump trucks. They're closer to shock infantry than they are to skirmishers. And now for a quick word on cavalry, the dwarves have none. And while a lord is carried around on a shield, a dwarf carried by dwarves is no faster. Now I'm going to talk about their artillery, which they have a plethora of. They field some of the best cannons in the game. They also have a cheaper option with the grudge thrower, which functions as a catapult, the bolt thrower, which is your classic ballista, the organ gun, which is great at mowing down lightly armored infantry and skirmishers and catching incoming cavalry, and then we have the flame cannon that, for all intents and purposes, functions as a giant flamethrower, so it's arguable if it's artillery because its range is limited, but that's beside the point. It's great at instilling panic in the enemy army because things that are on fire tend to panic. Now let's talk about special units. These guys are called miners, and in the tabletop version they have the ability to enter the battlefield after a couple of turns from any direction. So I can imagine in Total War that would function somewhat like guerrilla deployment, except maybe 30 seconds or so would have to pass and then they would pop up on the field wherever you deployed them. And this unit, called the gyrocopter, is probably the closest that the dwarves come to having a unit of cavalry. It comes equipped with a small cannon and bombs and is used for harassing approaching units and making sure units that have routed do not return to the battlefield. Therefore, abstractly, it functions as a light cavalry or perhaps a skirmish cavalry. Now when it comes to magic, dwarves don't have spells in the typical sense that the other factions do. Instead, they imbue their armor with runes that offer a variety of utilitarian buffs like boosting attack power and damage, or defense and overall survivability. But they can also do things like boost the accuracy of your artillery. So if you like artillery, that could be huge. Now the one thing that the dwarves do actually cast on the battlefield is Dispel. Dispel is the act of ending an ongoing spell, usually cast by that of your enemy. Now, any faction can technically dispel, the dwarves just excel at it, as it's facilitated by this thing called the Anvil of Doom. Now we're going to talk quickly about the various faction traits. The dwarves' first trait that I'm going to discuss is Ancestral Grudge, which basically means they're really good at fighting against factions they hate, for instance the orcs. Natural resistance pertains to their ability to deal with magic and shield wall we've already discussed. Relentless has to do with their endurance, and in Total War terms it probably means that they could march long distances as fast as their little legs could carry them without sustaining a bunch of fatigue penalties. Now, the last one is Resolute, which means they're good at charging. Because they're so slow, unless you're countercharging somebody charging you, it's probably going to take a little bit of finesse to set up a good one, though. Now let's talk tactics. Because the dwarves are slow and tend to be incredibly heavily armored and bring tons of long-range firepower to the battlefield, it allows them to take a defensive and reactionary stance. So they can fight on their terms and on the land that they choose, and dwarves like to choose something that benefits them, like a hill or another defensive position. As the enemy approaches, the dwarves like to whittle them down with barrages from their huge array of long-range weaponry. Then once the enemy is close enough, they either countercharge them or receive them on their heavy infantry so that they can serve as the anvil as their shock infantry swings into flanking positions. Then once the enemy begins to rout, they use gyrocopters to make sure that they never return. So if you're a player that enjoys a strong defensive position, reacting to and countering the enemy, then the dwarves are probably going to be right up your alley. However, if you ever have to go on the offensive either by choice or by force, you're probably going to find it very challenging. And if you ever find yourself fighting against the dwarves and they're within a walled keep that is well defended, good luck. Right, now let's talk a little bit about dwarven culture and how that might manifest on the strategic campaign map. They like to live in large mountainous fortresses, and they're certainly builders, so they'll probably hold land in the classical sense of Total War. And while the dwarves are known for acquiring a lot of loot, most of that wealth is going to be sunk into their extremely expensive troops. They're all wearing tons of armor or their big expensive war machines. Because of this, fielding a lot of large armies will probably be too much of a strain on their economy, so it's going to sort of have a slowing effect on their expansion and ultimately give dwarves that defensive nature that they're known for. Alright, thank you for watching. That is it for this video. Please remember to subscribe and all that good stuff. And as always, constructive criticism and feedback is greatly appreciated, and I definitely make use of it. Thanks and bye.